Welcome back to the House of Gouldians. This is episode 3 of season 2, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at a couple of different things. So you'll remember that we started in season 1 to develop a bloodline, and today's episode we're going to sort of move to the next stage of that. So what we're going to do is, in the education segment, we're going to look at particularly the head part of the model or standard and see what the requirements are there. And we're going to look at both the South African as well as the international sort of standard and see how the two compares and where there's similarities. So that's sort of the education segment. We're then going to apply that on the Majestic bloodline side, and we're going to be looking at the Spanish side of the bloodline, which is the orange-headed purple breast. So remember, we're naming them after the monarchs. And we're going to be looking at our choice of cocks in particular for the upcoming season. So I've made one or two substitutions on that side, and we're going to get into the detail on why I've done that, what sort of aspects of the model or standard we're missing, and how we need to make changes so that we can improve that and head that off. And then, so those are two segments of the show, and then the final segment is in the news. We've got the results from the Gouldian section of the Stafford National Show that took place in the UK. That was hosted by our friends at the British Gouldian Finch Club. So that's today's show, and I hope you enjoy it. Alright, so for the education side of the show today, we've moved indoors, and we're going to be ultimately, for the Majestic side, looking at the choice of our orange-headed purple breasts for the upcoming season and why we've gone for those birds. But before we can get there, we need to do today's education side so that you can understand my decision-making process behind these birds. Alright, so season 1, you'll remember that our focus was on 3 principal aspects of the standard. A, we wanted to not have any flatheads. B, we wanted to try and improve our size. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that we have the right shape or type, if you like, or model. You guys would refer to it as a model overseas. And that is basically the profile of the bird. So if we look at the picture of the South African standard, you can see this is what ultimately we're looking for. The head on this particular drawing, though, it's a little bit straight, the line from the beak to the top of the head. It would be slightly more rounded if you read the description of the standard. So we just need to keep that in mind. But the point is, in season 1, we were looking at improving our size to between 120 and 140 millimeters. In terms of the 3 birds behind us, we're certainly within that bracket, but we're at the lower end. So we've still got a bit of work to do in terms of size. Ideally, I want to get it up to 140 millimeters. And the reason for that is that the international standard is 145 millimeters as the minimum. So we really need to be on the upper end of the South African standard so that if there is another international show, we're within the ballpark. Ideally, I would actually like them to be slightly over, because it's always easier to go smaller, but it's more of a challenge long term to get bigger. So we are going to continue working in terms of the size aspect of our line, our Majestic bloodline. So the next thing that we said was in terms of the shape. So we've discussed that we wanted the round chest or belly area, and we wanted the straight back end, and that we also looked at season 1. And then, like I said, we wanted that round head. This season, though, we're wanting to go beyond that, because all 3 of these birds meet the minimum size criteria. They've all got a rounded head, they don't have the flat head, and they're all sort of starting to move away from that sort of more elongated bird, and they're starting to show a little bit of nice shape in terms of the front, and they've all got the straight back line. Okay, so from those sides of it, we're starting to tick the boxes. So now let's look in detail at the markings, and why is that the next thing on my sort of agenda in terms of our standard within our Majestic bloodline and the Spanish line. It's remember, the Gouldian Finch is a colour bird primarily, not a type bird. Yes, type is incredibly important on the show bench as well with the Gouldian, but it's not the biggest point section of the bird. The biggest points, whether it's the NBVV standard or whether it's the South African standard, actually comes from the colour aspects of the bird. So we really need to start focusing on that side of it. So let's have a quick read through the South African side of things, and then we're going to look at the NBVV side of it so that we can see where the commonalities are, and then we can then go ahead to the Majestic bloodline and actually discuss the various birds. So the South African model or standard, we said, was the ideal length is between 120 and 140 millimeters in length. False would be an overly large or a small bird. In terms of the type, the body shape, we have 15 points, and that is, we're looking for a bird that is substantial and should taper elegantly towards the tail. The outline, taking from the beak over the crown, down the nape, back, rump and tail should be flowing. In other words, that straight line that we're referring to, and you want that rounded belly and breast. The faults on that back line would be if there was a nip neck, narrow chest or hollow backs, or ruched backs as we call it, as well, in terms of it like a humpback. And then obese birds would also be considered a fault. So those were the aspects that we dealt with last year. The head, and this is quite important, it must be neat and not elongated in proportion to the size of the body. We want a round head with a neat beak that is short and both mandibles fitting closely together. The position of the eye should be central to the roundness of the head. Then the faults is quite important here. Overly large or thick beaks, a flat crown or snaky head, a narrow forehead, or over or undershot mandibles. So in other words, if the top beak is longer than the bottom, or the bottom beak's longer than the top. So those would be the sort of faults, if you like. Now, if we compare that to the NBVV version, the size is, like we said, a minimum of 145 millimeters. But then I'm looking specifically at the head and the beak. We're looking for, once again, a rounded head, and a flat head would be a fault. Once again, it's considered as disturbing. And then the head should be nicely proportionate to the body. So there you can see it's almost identical to the South African version, though it's just a wording difference. The beak color, they don't assess as part of the beak as such. That gets put under the color section, but it does go on to say that the beak shall be free of deformities. The shape of the beak is also very important, and the bill should be cone shaped and blend into the shape of the head. Very important. Large and pointed beaks should be punished, as well as overgrowth of either the lower or upper beak. Okay, so you can see that the shape wise, we're looking for the same things at this point. There's no real differences in terms of the head shape requirements for either standard or the beak requirements on either the South African or the NBVV standard. Okay. This portion of the NBVV standard is a little bit more detailed than the South African version that I'm about to go through with you. And for that reason, I'm going to choose to follow the NBVV standard, as I happen to agree with it, and it's missing in terms of the detail for the South African standard. So I wouldn't be sort of doing myself in on the show bench by following the NBV standard, and quite frankly, I think this is something that we need to look at going forward with the South African one. So I'm going to start with the drawings or markings of the bird. So the Gouldian Finch naturally has many drawing fields, so that the most points can be obtained in this section, and that's what I was saying to you. The color portions of the bird is your most important part when it comes to a Gouldian, and then your type. Okay, The drawing fields must be clearly visible and well defined. So what you don't want with the Gouldian Finch, you don't want a blending of, for example, the purple into the yellow, and that gives you that fusion line, which is a red, sort of looks red to the eye. But what it actually is the purple and the yellow are blending together, and it's giving you that color. So that is actually considered a fault on the international standard. Okay. The mask, the red-headed and orange-headed Gouldians, the mask extends from the beak plant to the crown and extends behind the eye and entire cheek area. It is delimited by the headband and the throat spot. Bear this in mind for the next part when we move on to the Majestic bloodline. In the black-headed Gouldian Finch, the mask, the headband and the throat spot form one whole. So in other words, it's got to be complete. There shouldn't be color variation. It should look like one solid piece. All right. The mask must be tightly lined and one color without color nuances. So that's what I was saying. It needs to be as if it's one piece. Okay, the headband in the red and orange headed Gouldians. And this is the part that's particularly relevant to the next part of the discussion. The red and orange headed Gouldians have a narrow headband closed at least 1 to 2 millimeters around the mask. So it must be continuous. You don't want breaks in it. And it must be 1 to 2 millimeters thick. Now, personally, if it's too thick, it makes the mask or color portion look smaller. So for the purposes of what I'm going to be looking for, I'm aiming at about 1 millimeter thickness. 2 mils for me would be a little bit too thick. But provided I'm in that ballpark, I've got the benefit of, if there is that World Online Show again, next year or whatever, that we would then still be within the sort of ideal, and therefore we won't lose points if I'm sitting at about 1 millimeter, just over 1 millimeter. The headband should be taunt in shape, and I'll explain what we mean with that, forming one whole with the throat spot, and the headband should not have a recess towards the eye. Now that's quite important, and it's something that I've picked up in quite a few of the birds in the birdroom, and it's something that we need to look out for going forward. So part of the benefit of running a bloodline that is aiming at the show quality, if as we breed with those, I won't really sell the bloodline. I would rather take those birds and utilize them in my mutations project. The reason being is that then we're going to take all these aspects that we're developing and improving on with the birds, and we're going to be filtering them across the different mutation projects. But we need to have a line that is our primary focus, and that is why the Majestic bloodline is so important for me. It's about getting that model type, color markings, the drawings, or whatever you want to call them, 100% correct, or as close as we can to it, should I say, so that it then benefits all the birds in the birdroom going forward. So coming back to what they were talking about, we're not having a recess by the eye. If you look at a lot of the birds, you will notice that it's like I've got a cheekbone here, it looks concave in this portion on the bird. That we don't want. So ideally it should be convex, so in other words a nice rounded shape, but at the very least you would want it sort of flat. On the black-headed bird, you're going to look to the outer sort of portion of the black to pick up whether it's a problem or not. With the red and the orange-headed birds, you can see it clearly because you've got that black line, so you're wanting to try and get that as round as possible. Okay, so that's what we're looking for in terms of that black headband or marking. The throat patch runs sharply outlined below the cheeks from the inset of the lower beak and is there for one whole with the headband. The throat band The mask and throat patch are surrounded by a single coloured band called the chin and transition zone, respectively. The chin strap, located between the throat spot and the chest, should be narrow in shape and sharply separated from the patch of the throat and the chest. So that transition zone, you don't want blending of colours, you want a nice sharp line, in other words. All right, and then the transition zone that is located on the back of the mask, that is blended. So that's that turquoise color in the cockbird, and you want a definite line in terms of the black and that turquoise, but on the other side of the turquoise, on the green side of the bird, in other words, on a standard bird, you want that blending of the color, so it drifts from the blue into the green. It's not a definite line as such. All right, so that's what you're wanting. Obviously, a hen bird doesn't really have that turquoise transition zone, but you still, on the black, you're wanting a definite line. Okay. So at the rear, it gradually merges into the feathers of the neck. Okay. The chest patch extends from the throat band to a line running. So in other words, that's the purple portion on a classic bird, and running from the wing bend or shoulder to the other side of the wing bend. So where there is a sharp separation of color from the lower breast, so that's normally the yellow portion of the bird, the base color must be a single color without nuances. Okay, so you don't want a patchy color, you want evenness of color on the yellow and on the purple in a classic bird. Your white-breasted Gouldian, often if you keep pairing white to white breast, goes patchy over time, or it goes like a sort of a beigey color when you start getting beigey patches in between. Okay, so every now and then you need to breed it back to a purple split white breast, and that will then revitalize that bright white color. So those are the sort of fundamentals that we were looking for in terms of the head and chest markings. Okay. On a classic bird though, we're also wanting a bird that has a nice even color in terms of the green on the wings. Okay, you don't want a patchy bird as well. You want that even color. Now remember the yellow rump mutation in South Africa, you get yellow etching on the wing feathers. So you do get a little bit of yellow mixed in with the green. That is part of that mutation. So that's the exception to the rule. But on a green bird, you want a nice even green. On a yellow bird, you want yellow. You do not want green feathers mixed in. On a pied bird, you ideally want 50-50 feather ratio of green to yellow or yellow to green. And on the blue variation of the pied, you would want white and blue. 50%. So that's the ideal that you would be striving to in terms of the back colors of those particular mutations. Then the last sort of color portion that we're going to discuss today is the rump area of the bird. So in the classic birds, you're wanting a rump that has white etching, so it looks almost like a scalloping effect going down the back, the rump of the bird. However, on the yellow rumps, you want it clear. There's no scalloping. It must be a nice even yellow throughout. And obviously on your yellow birds, you're not going to have that blue, so it's also going to be an even coloring. You don't want the sort of variation on the coloring. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for this sort of our choices this season, should I say. In season 1 of the show, you will remember we had Oda and Josephine that bred successfully for us. Unfortunately, Eureka and Alfonso, they were first year birds, and you remember that the first year pairings, and none of them really bred successfully with the exception of 1 or 2 chicks that we had right towards the end of the season. Josephine, unfortunately, just before the molt, she had finished with her last clutch of youngsters, and then suddenly she was fine one day, and when I walked in the next morning she was dead. There was no illness period in terms of visible being ill. So it could have been a heart attack. She might have injured herself from a night fright. I don't know what actually happened. But anyway, the point is, of Odo, we still have him. But remember, Odo, we had paired him to Josephine because of her head shape. So he had the size that we were looking for, and so did she. He was slightly longer than she was. So she had the better type. But and she had a more rounded head. So in other words, Josephine had more going for her than Odo did. But the offspring that we got from them, we were quite happy with from that first season already. And then last season's bird, which was their season 2, we've got a couple of chicks from them, but they're still busy colouring up. So we can't evaluate them just yet. But given how sort of similar the brothers and the sister was, I can only imagine it's going to be more of the same. So I will keep them in reserve in case we lose a bird. But we can now start sort of moving on, if you like. Alfonso and Eureka, on the other hand, they had good type. Eureka did one on the show bench for us, but she was lacking size, and so was Alfonso. So given our options this year, with these 3 birds that I've chosen, I decided to eliminate them from the program in terms of the Majestic side. I am keeping them on the back burner, if you like, so they're going out into the aviary, and they will be there in case we lose either a cock or a hen bird. At least we can use them as a replacement. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to regress in terms of the size of the bird. The type on them were great, and the colors were good, but they were lacking the size. So I've decided to rather move forward with these 3 individuals. Okay, so who do we have? So in the middle, this particular bird is the best of the brothers that Odo and Josephine produced for us. He's got the best head shape. He's got the most rounded belly. He's still a little bit elongated for my liking, so we've still got to work on the front of the bird a little bit and sort of fill him out a little bit in terms of our choice of pairings. We want him to pair him up with a more robust female, that we can improve that type over time. And the back, he's got the profile that I'm looking for. This particular bird is not a good show bird because of the way you can see him getting stressed out in the show cage. Okay, he's just been put in there today, so in all fairness, a bit of training would probably help. But he also tends to carry himself in a bit of a peculiar way in a show cage, whereas if you put him in the normal cage environment, as you can see by this picture, he then puffs himself up nicely and he looks fantastic. The moment you put him in a show cage, he sucks all his feathers right close to his body, so he looks as thin as possible. He makes himself as tall as possible, but then he does things like lean forward and put his head back, or that kind of thing, so he gives himself a nip neck and he messes up his position on perch, in other words. So he's not the greatest show bird, but that doesn't mean we can't use him in terms of our breeding program. So that's our carryover from season 1. I'm also going to be using his sister. His sister's not a bad sized bird. She's not quite as big as the other 2 hens that I'm going to be using this season, but she's not bad. She is a black-headed bird, but because both Odo and Josephine were orange heads, we know she's carrying the genes for orange head, and therefore we can use her in this particular project. So I will pair her, obviously not to her brother, I will pair her to one of these 2 birds. So either number 1 or 3. The sort of next aspect that I wanted to sort of take into account, and this is why in the education segment I wanted to discuss the markings. Unfortunately with him, that line that is supposed to be the head strap that is supposed to go around the back of the head is virtually non-existent. Odo and Josephine had that headline, or that headband, should I say, but for some reason in him and 2 of the other brothers, they didn't carry that over in terms of the birds, at least in terms of the markings. So it's something I need to be very aware of going forward, because we don't want to breed that into our line. But at the same time, he's a very good size, and he's got a lot of other things going for him. But as a result, I made sure that my other 2 picks have the line that we're looking for, particularly the one bird. He's just over 1 millimeter in terms of that black line. So I've made sure that we're compensating 2-to-1 for the new gene that we're wanting, or should we say the correct marking that we're wanting. Okay, so that would be my concern with him. 2 things. We're wanting to improve the belly shape or breast shape to a more rounded look, and we're wanting to improve on the marking. So when we pick a hen for him, we're going to pick one with a nice sort of thicker headband, and one that's quite robust or has a fuller breast or chest. Okay, so that's our choice there. This particular bird, I've already mentioned why we've chosen him. Firstly, out of the 3, he's got the best type. He's the most robust, he's got a good head shape, and he's got good size to him. And he's totally and utterly unrelated to anything else in the bird room. He's a new addition that came in. So from that perspective, I'm very happy. He's also got nice strong colors, so that's great. And he's got that line that we're looking for on the breast going into between the purple and the yellow. He's got the white scalloping, not that Odo the second, for lack of a better word, doesn't. But more importantly, he's got that headband that we're looking for the offspring going forward. Okay, so that's our choice, our reason for him. He, for me, would basically be the ideal that we're looking for. A little bit more round on the head, perhaps, and a little bit bigger. Remember, we said we're going to try for the 140, and a little bit more robust. But he's certainly the closest to what we're looking for at this point. This little guy over here, he's not as small as Alfonso was. In fact, let me just move side so that you can see him more clearly. And he has the right shaped head, and he has the correct marking. So he's got that headband that we're looking for. And he's not a badly sized bird. He's probably comparable to Odo the second. But he's a little bit elongated for my liking. So he's got his negatives, and that's why he would be my number 3 choice. But once again, we will make sure that we pair him up to the right option in terms of that. Okay, so the hens, which we will take a look at the next time with the Majestic bloodline, and discuss those particular ones. They're still in the molt, and that's why we're not looking at them today, because they're not quite 100% through. But we're going to be looking at the biggest size and type to go with him, because that will be our focus, and all his and her offspring will then go to the pairings from the other 2. So that they're going to be our key stone, if you like, to the bloodline going forward. We then have this particular bird, and we're going to pair him up, like we said, to one that's got a nice broad line at the back and that's a bit more robust. So not necessarily the biggest out of the 3 females, but the one that's got the best sort of shaping on the chest and that marking that we're looking for. And then this is our sort of backup pair, if you like, so that we've got a totally unrelated blood that we can then use. And we don't want to lose or go backwards on the head shape or size, so we're going to be looking for the biggest hen we can once we've paired up these 2 to go with him, and one that won't sort of take us backwards in terms of the markings. So that's sort of 1, 2, and 3. In terms of the news section of today's show, we said we were going to have a look at the results from the Stafford National Show that took place in the UK, and the Gouldian section in particular we're having a look at, and that was hosted by the British Gouldian Finch Club. So yeah, let's have a look at those results. The best on show was won by Javier Pinacorazo, and that was with his black-headed classic cock. So it obviously also won the best black-headed classic. The second best black-headed classic went to Dave McDivitt, and the third black-headed classic was also won by Javier. So congratulations to the two of you. In terms of the hens, both the best and second best hen was won by Dave, and the third best hen was won by Javier. In terms of the red-headed birds, Dave took first and second, and then the third best red-headed cock was won by Full Bullock. Javier then went on to prove the consistency of type in his birdroom by winning first, second and third for the orange-headed classic birds, which is extraordinary. And then finally, the mutation section was won by Javier, second went to Mark Blur, and third was won by Dave. So yeah, congratulations to all the winners on that show, and also to all those who took part and helped make the day a great day. So I hope you enjoyed today's show. I realized that it was a little bit more sort of in-depth and a little bit perhaps less entertaining as maybe the breeder feature from the previous episode. But it's important that we understand the show requirements so that we can improve the quality over time. So that's why I wanted to go through that in a lot more detail with you, so that you can see how we've progressed from season 1, where we were looking to improve the size of the bird. Now we're kind of getting where we need to be with size. We've still got a little bit of work to do, but we're getting there. Now we're sort of starting to focus on very important aspects in terms of colors and markings and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, it's all part of this journey in terms of developing that Majestic bloodline where we started the House of Gouldians, and how we're going to you're going to see that progression over the years. So yeah, a very important episode today, and then the next episode we're going to be having another breeder feature, and this time with Javier, that won the British show that you just heard about in the news. He's a very interesting individual. He's been involved with birds since he was very young, and it's a little bit back in time in the sense that we filmed that discussion before the British show actually happened. So just in terms of timing, obviously when we film things and when we actually air them don't always sort of work in chronological order, but yeah, nevertheless it should be a really interesting episode in 2 weeks time.